Good day, everyone. This is your captain speaking. And today we will be taking a look at one of the most notorious pirates to ever sail the seven seas during the golden age of piracy. A man whom Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator and author of the world-famous Sherlock Holmes stories, once described as savage and desperate, and a man of amazing and grotesque brutality. So weigh anchor and hoist the mizzen, lads, because today we're digging into the history of Edward Ned Lowe to discover the man behind the myth. Ned Low was born in Westminster, London, England, in the year 1690, to a poor family of thieves and criminals. Illiterate and quarrelsome by nature, he spent a good chunk of his youth running wild in the streets of Westminster as a pickpocket, gambler, and cheat, often playing games of chance with the footmen from the House of Lords nearby. Not much else is known of his family, save that he had a younger brother named Richard, who also turned to a life of crime from a young age. One story of their exploits tells of how one of their friends would carry a basket on his back, with young Richard, who was small for his age, sitting inside, snatching the hats off of those passing by. Richard was sentenced to be hanged by the neck until dead, alongside two other accomplices, on the 10th of December in the year 1707, in Tyburn, Middlesex, England. Eventually, Ned Low would grow tired of his life as a pickpocket and street thief, and instead turn his efforts to burglary. And at some point after, he left England behind for the shores of the New World, making his way across the Atlantic and summarily settling in Boston, Massachusetts. It was here that he would meet a woman by the name of Eliza Marble. Low and Marble married on the 12th of August in the year 1714 at the First Church of Boston. The couple would go on to have two children, a son who died in infancy, and a daughter named Elizabeth. Eliza tragically gave her life in the birth of their daughter in 1719. The untimely loss of his wife would have a profound and lasting effect on Low. As a result of this, after turning pirate, Low would not allow married men to be press-ganged into his crew, instead setting them free. And any women he captured would be returned to port safely and unmolested. By 1722, Low had departed Boston and set to sea, leaving his daughter Elizabeth behind, a decision that he would come to express deep grief and regret over later in life. He worked as part of the rigging crew on a sloop bound for Honduras, on a venture to retrieve a cargo of lumber, which they would then resell in Boston for a profit. As a patron in the venture, Low was tasked with supervising the transport and loading of the cargo. One day, however, when Low and his men returned to the ship for food and water, the captain of the vessel informed them that they would have to wait and make do with a ration of rum to hold them over. Enraged, Low took up a loaded musket and fired at the captain. The shot missed, however, and instead struck another sailor through the throat, killing him. Following this altercation, Low and his friends were ousted from the vessel. The next day, Low and his entourage, which at the time included Francis Farrington Spriggs, who would later go on to become a reputable pirate captain in his own right, took over another sloop off the coast of Rhode Island. One man was killed during the attack, and rather than face the fury of the law, Low and his men decided to turn pirate, determined to, quote, go in her, make a black flag, and declare war against all the world. Now with a ship of his own, Low and his crew stalked the popular shipping lanes between New York and Boston, and within a week had plundered another sloop out of Rhode Island, cutting the rigging of the ship to prevent them from returning to port too soon and raising the alarm. From the eastern coast of North America, Low and his crew headed south to Grand Cayman, where he worked for a time as a lieutenant to the pirate captain George Lowther aboard a ship named the Happy Delivery. The 10-ton Rhode Island sloop was heavily armed, outfitted with 8 cannon and 10 swivel guns, but was ultimately, quote, destroyed by Indians. This would force Lothar, Lowe, and the crew to transfer to another ship under their control, called the Ranger. During this time, Lowe began to develop a taste for cruelty, for which he would swiftly gain a reputation. One of his more famous torture methods was to tie his victims' hands together with rope between the fingers and then set the rope on fire, which would in turn sear and burn the flesh all the way down to the bones. On the 28th of May, 1722, George Lothar would capture a large brigantine with 6 guns named the Rebecca. This ship he gifted to Lowe, along with a crew of 44 men. Once again captaining his own ship, Lowe would dissolve his partnership with Lothar, and the two would part ways on good terms. In June of the same year, Lowe and his crew attacked a fleet of 13 vessels in the waters near Port Roseway in Shelburne, Nova Scotia. Raising his black flag, Lowe declared that no quarter would be given to any man who resisted. The vessels surrendered without a fight, and Lowe's crew would then plunder each and every one of them. Lowe would also take the largest of the 13 vessels as his own. The ship was a schooner, weighing 80 tons, which he armed with 10 guns and made his flagship. He would name this ship the Fancy. Before departing Port Roseway, Lowe fired upon and sank all 12 remaining vessels, taking in their unfortunate crews as his prisoners. He would also abandon his former flagship, the Rebecca. On the 9th of July, 1722, the Boston Newsletter published a list of all those captured by Lowe during the raid on Port Roseway. Among these prisoners was a man named Philip Ashton, who would later escape and become stranded on the island of Roatan. In his memoirs, which many at first believed to be a novel in the style of Robinson Crusoe, Ashton would give a detailed accounting of his time among Lowe's crew.
Of all the piratical crews that were ever heard of, none of the English name came up to this in barbarity. Their mirth and their anger had much the same effect, for both were usually gratified with the cries and groans of their prisoners, so that they almost as often murdered a man from an excess of good humor as out of passion and resentment. And the unfortunate could never be assured of safety from them, for danger lurked in their very smiles.
During his time among Lowe's crew, Ashton reported that he had been beaten, whipped, and bound in chains, and he would often receive threats of death from Lowe's quartermaster, a man by the name of John Russell, who resented Ashton for his repeated refusals to sign Lowe's articles and join their crew. During his time as a buccaneer, Lowe was known for the tactic of flying false colors, a ruse designed to lull unsuspecting targets into dropping their guard long enough for he and his men to maneuver into striking distance. This deception did not always pan out in his favor, however, and on at least one occasion, Lowe mistook a fully armed man-of-war for a smaller fishing vessel, and through some stroke of good fortune barely managed to escape the encounter with both his life and ship intact. Lowe operated for a time near Newfoundland, taking several prizes before traversing the Atlantic and making his way to the Azores Islands. It was here that he would capture a narrow-sterned former man-of-war, which he would make his new flagship, renaming it the Rose Pink. Also during his time in the Azores Islands, Lowe would capture an English ship with 2 Portuguese passengers on board. In yet another spectacular show of cruelty, Lowe would have these 2 Portuguese men bound and dropped from the yardarm over and over again until they both finally died from their injuries. Lowe left the Azores Islands behind for Cape Verde, and from there made his way toward the coast of Brazil. Before he could reach Brazil, however, he was forced to turn back due to harsh weather. He instead set his sights on the Caribbean. 40 leagues east of Suriname, Lowe and his fleet careened both the Rose Pink and the Fancy to clear their hulls of barnacles. Despite his time at sea, Lowe was still relatively inexperienced as a sailor and made the mistake of not only leaving the portholes open, but also ordering too many men to the task of clearing the hull. The Rose Pink capsized. Taking on water, she floundered and eventually sank to the ocean floor, taking 2 souls with her into the deep. In addition to the lives lost, the majority of Lowe's food and water stores had been resting in the Rose Pink's hold, and as a consequence, Lowe and his crew were forced to ration their remaining resources, with each man only being allowed to drink half a pint of water a day. Lowe now captained a schooner from his fleet named the Squirrel, and made his way to the French-owned island of Grenada in the West Indies, having been prevented from reaching his original destination of Tobago due to harsh weather and strong currents. Upon arriving in Grenada, Lowe hid most of his crew below decks and negotiated with local authorities to send a small contingent of his men ashore to collect water. The next day, the French sent a sloop out to investigate Lowe's ship, but they were in turn captured when Lowe's hidden crew emerged from below decks and ambushed them. Taking the sloop as his own, Lowe renamed it the Ranger and gave the Squirrel over to the command of Francis Spriggs, who had been with him since the very beginning of his career in piracy. Spriggs changed the name of the Squirrel to the Delight and broke ties with Lowe, sailing off in the middle of the night after a small altercation between the two. Lowe's fleet would grow with the taking of more sloops, including one that Lowe took for himself and renamed the Fortune. An original crewman of the Fortune would later testify during a trial for one of Lowe's men, saying that Lowe had plundered his ship, beat him mercilessly, and cut off one of his ears with a cutlass. In January of 1723, Lowe captured a Portuguese ship called La Nostra Senhora de Victoria. The ship's captain threw a bag of coins worth approximately 15,000 pounds in gold overboard, rather than let it fall into Lowe's hands. In response to this, Lowe cut the man's lips from his face with a cutlass and had them broiled. The captain was then forced to eat them while they were still fresh and piping hot. His crew was then executed, each and every one of them being put to the sword. Lowe would exhibit many more acts of cruelty throughout his career. One story tells of him burning a captured French cook alive, saying, "He was a greasy fellow, and he will fry well." Another story tells of how Lowe personally executed 53 Spanish captives with his own cutlass. Other tales paint a gruesome picture of mutilations, disemboweling, and decapitations. During one of these torture and murder sessions, Lowe was accidentally struck by one of his own crew, being cut across the mouth with a sword. The cut was poorly repaired, leaving Lowe permanently scarred. Eventually, Lowe's reputation grew to such heights that an official bounty was placed on his head. During this time, Lowe would strike up a partnership with fellow pirate Charles Harris, and together the two would travel to and terrorize the Azores Islands. With his reputation growing, pressure from local authorities mounted as their desire to see Lowe captured or killed grew exponentially. Eventually, the two would leave the Azores Islands behind and make sail for the Carolinas. On the 10th of June, 1723, the HMS Greyhound, a heavily armed man of war under the command of a man named Peter Solgaard, defeated Lowe and Harris, forcing Lowe to beat a hasty retreat back to the Azores with his ship the Fancy with approximately 150,000 pounds of gold on board, leaving Harris and the Ranger behind to be captured. Harris and many of his crew were tried and eventually executed for their crimes, with Harris himself being sent back to England, where he would be hanged at Execution Dock in Wapping, East London. Angered by his rout at the hands of the Greyhound, Lowe sailed north from the Azores Islands once more and captured a whaling vessel. He tortured and killed the captain, then set the remaining crew adrift on the Atlantic without provisions, intending for them to starve to death on the open sea. The crew would miraculously survive, arriving safely in Nantucket, Massachusetts several days later. Shortly after, in the waters near Rhode Island, Lowe captured a fishing boat. He beheaded the ship's master and set the rest of the crew ashore to be released. By this point, Lowe had begun to show such cruelty that even his own men refused to follow his orders, as demonstrated when they disobeyed his command to torture and kill the crews of two more vessels that they captured shortly after. Lowe returned south in late June of the same year, and there captured a merchant vessel sailing out of Virginia. The ship was named the Merry Christmas, and Lowe was noted to have been, quote, particularly cruel to his English victims. He outfitted the Merry Christmas with 34 guns and made her his new flagship. With his fleet in tow, Lowe would rejoin forces with George Lowther in July of 1723 and reunite with Francis Spriggs sometime later. Lowe, Lowther, and Spriggs captured a ship by the name of the Delight, which was given to Spriggs. 2 days later, both Lowther and Spriggs would abandon Lowe, taking most of his fleet with them, leaving him with only the Merry Christmas as his sole vessel. There are conflicting reports as to the fate of Ned Lowe. Captain Charles Johnson, believed by some to be the English writer Daniel Defoe, writing under a pseudonym, stated in his book, A General History of the Pirates, that Lowe and his ship the Fancy were both last sighted off the coast of Africa, near the Canary Islands. He also noted a rumor that Lowe was last sighted on his way to Brazil, and another that claimed his ship went down in a storm with all hands lost. Yet another story, from the pirate's own book by Charles Elms, suggests that Lowe was set adrift without provisions following a mutiny by the crew of the Merry Christmas. This was in response to Lowe supposedly murdering one of his own men in their sleep following an argument. While this claim is unsubstantiated, the Merry Christmas would indeed reappear without Lowe, captained by Richard Shipton, and would go on to sail with Francis Spriggs once more. In this version of the tale, Lowe was rescued by French sailors. The sailors eventually learned of his true identity and took him to the island of Martinique to be tried and hanged in 1724. It is worth noting that the National Maritime Museum in London states that Lowe was never caught and lived out the remainder of his days in Brazil. Ned Lowe, without a shadow of a doubt, was a cruel and vicious man who more than earned his reputation as one of the most notorious figures of the golden age of piracy. He is often mentioned alongside the likes of Edward Teach, aka Blackbeard, Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts, and William Fly as one of the most terrifying and dangerous pirates to ever sail the seven seas. Lowe has featured on both stamps and commemorative currency all over the Caribbean at some time or another. A postage stamp bearing his likeness was issued by the Cayman Islands in 1975, and in 1994, Lowe and his brigantine the Rebecca were featured on a $100 note issued by the government of Antigua and Barbuda. The bill was made of leaf gold. Ned Lowe is one of the pirates depicted on Disney's famous Pirates of the Caribbean ride at Disneyland, California, and his flag was used as the Jolly Roger of the fictional pirate Sao Feng in the 2007 film Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End. He was portrayed by Irish actor Tig Murphy in Season 2 of the Starz hit series Black Sails in 2015. And to this day, treasure hunters still dive the waters around the Isle of Shoals off the coast of New Hampshire and Isle Haut in Nova Scotia for artifacts from ships that he sank. Thank you all for watching. This has been Man Behind the Myth. Once again, I am your host, Captain Crowseye. Please leave a like and a comment if the mood strikes you, and God's willing, I'll see you all next time. Farewell.